Welcome, attendees, presenters to this event, New Developments in Online Extremism and Implications for Youth Work. To begin with, just a couple of administrative details. We're going to record this event and put it online for the people who had other meetings or for other reason they couldn't attend. Also, I guess you have noticed that your mics and cameras are off. However, you can ask, and I really encourage you to ask anytime questions in the chat function or to make comments. We will pick up on them and address them to the speakers. Our agenda is actually quite simple. We're going to start with a keynote by Jakob Guhl from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, followed by a short period of questions and then a panel discussion with the rest of the participants, whom I will introduce later. But before I do this, I think I should probably mention why we're organizing this event today. This is the final event of a project, which is called CAYET, focused on capacity building in youth work in dealing with new forms of extremism. It is an Erasmus Plus project, a small-scale project, and what it did is to develop 2 repositories for the purposes of youth work in the area of preventing violent extremism. One of the repositories, it's called, actually, they're both in German, so it is for the German-speaking part of Europe. However, and this is one of the points of Erasmus Plus, of course, is to disseminate these results broadly and also to explore to which extent we can actually roll out these kinds of outputs to other countries and other languages as well. So the first repository is focusing on scientific content. So it's giving an overview of extremist scenes in Austria and Germany, main concepts, main theories, but obviously in an accessible way. And also the latest developments. So the idea for it being youth workers need to be up to date with what's going on in the extremist scenes, so their work can be optimized in that sense. The second repository, whose link will also be put on the chat, is a collection of actual tools, so practical tools to apply in the youth work. And both of these repositories are focusing especially on jihadism and right-wing extremism. We, of course, are thinking of expanding this to also other areas of extremism, but again, it was a small-scale project, and this is what we managed to achieve. However, I think they are interesting, so I encourage you to have a look, check out the links that were put in the chat for these 2 repositories. And with this, I will go to our main speaker today, who is Jakob Guhl from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and he will talk to us about the evolving landscape of online extremism. A couple of background information, although he might be known to the people working in this field already and very well. He's focusing on topics such as disinformation extremism, both jihadism, Salafism, but also right-wing extremism, in particular in Germany, but also in Western Europe more broadly. He is senior manager in policy and research at the ISD. He has advised a number of German authorities at the federal and local level. He has published in quite a lot of newspapers. I'm just going to mention Die Zeit at this point, and CNN as well, TV stations. So he's very well known. And of course, there are a couple of very interesting and important research reports that ISD has produced and where he was either author or co-author. So I encourage you to visit their website and check them out. With this, I give you the floor, Jakob. 20 minutes. I will be ruthless regarding the 20 minutes and really look forward to your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Daniela. That shouldn't be an issue. So I'll be speaking about the evolving landscape of online extremism, and I will be speaking specifically about 6 points, 6 kind of theses that I hope can kind of set the stage for our subsequent discussion. So there's 6 trends I really want to highlight today, and they are I think we're visiting the internationalization of the extreme right facilitated by social media on a few different levels. We're seeing that formal extremist discussion organizations are becoming less relevant, and that often people operate in a kind of post-organizational setting. We are witnessing, especially online, but also increasingly in offline protest movements associated with extremism, that the lines between extremism and adjacent harms, such as disinformation, conspiracy theories, and harassment, are becoming increasingly blurred. While a lot of focus has been on the extreme right over the last few years, where Islamist extremists, of course, continue to operate, and they are drawing on a growing range of formats to communicate their message. The 5th thesis is that there's a kind of convergence online in terms of the subcultural aesthetics across different extremist and authoritarian movements, across ideologies, across geographic contexts. And lastly, kind of on the platform level, that the shifting platform landscape and the migrations away from big platforms may make it harder to appropriately research, track, and also counter extremism online. Yeah. Great. So in terms of the internationalization of the extreme right, I think this is really happening on a few levels. We see this in terms of the ideas and ideologies, but also in terms of identities and communities. On a level of ideas and ideologies, the best example to demonstrate this really is the Great Replacement theory, which was originally coined by relatively obscure French far-right philosophers, was taken up by the identitarian movement, including the Identitäre Bewegung in Germany, in Austria, pushed through social media, adopted by the alt-right in the US in 2015 to 2017, very prominently, of course, chanted in Charlottesville, the slogan, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," and something that has now continued to inspire extreme right attacks across the world, in Christchurch, in Poway, in Pittsburgh, in Halle. And so this is really a kind of transnational exchange, the promotion of ideas across borders. But it's not purely on this level. It's also in terms of the kind of identities that are being formed. Some of the propaganda, you see one example on the bottom left by the identitarian movement, which again, quite active in the German-speaking context as well. They're also increasingly emphasizing not just the kind of national identity, but a broader European, often implicitly white or racial idea. So it's a forming of a transnational idea within extreme right communities. The Halle attacker in his live stream and manifesto referred himself not just as a kind of German nationalist, but expressed concern about the situation of white communities supposedly under siege worldwide. And you really see in the online space that people are forming transnational communities as well. So it's, I think, different to how it would have been in the 60s or 70s, where, of course, there were some far-right philosophers and activists that had intentions to create transnational communities. You do have a much lower threshold to actually form these communities online, inspire each other, and share instructional material to commit far-right attacks. And so I think the ease of forming transnational communities has greatly increased. Connected to this trend is the second thesis that formal organizations, formal extremist organizations, are becoming less relevant. This is not necessarily a completely new phenomenon. I mean, there have been different thinkers, if you may call it like that, both in jihadist circles as well as in extreme right circles, who have hypothesized that really you should lead a leaderless resistance, or you should inspire leaderless resistance where there's no formal hierarchies and clear structures, not like, you know, the old school Al-Qaeda type organizations or formally organized white supremacist groups, but that instead there should be autonomous cells, autonomous actors that conduct attacks. Louis Beam in the US was very inspirational here, Abu Musab al-Suri in the jihadist context. And we are seeing some of this manifest now as well. The graphic on the bottom here, which is from the RTV trend report and from the University of Oslo in 2021, you see actually that the majority of plots on the extreme right are not perpetrated anymore by people who are organized as part of formal groups. And I think social media dynamics play a huge role here, as they make it possible to kind of get in contact with extremist ideas, in contact with extremist networks, without necessarily joining your offline, formally organized groups. The third trend that I really want to highlight is that some of the lines between extremism and different adjacent harms are becoming more blurry. We're seeing this very much in the online space, where you see on platforms like Telegram that conspiracy theorists, skeptics of traditional medicine, QAnon adherents, neo-Nazis, people supportive of the Identitäre Bewegung. Again, people who may have all kinds of disagreements in terms of their worldview are operating in the same spaces, are forwarding each other's content, and are therefore forming these kind of hybrid communities where it's increasingly difficult to clearly delineate between different groups, between the audiences of different influencers, and by the different harms they may commit. And this is to some extent manifesting in the offline world as well. On the bottom, for those that don't speak German, I'll kind of explain what it is. This is the statistics from the Federal Crime Agency on politically motivated crime over the last year. And really the crucial number on the bottom right, there is the plus 147%, which is the increase of politically motivated crime committed by people that can't quite be categorized as merely far right, far left, religious extremism, Islamist extremism, related to the PKK or so, the kind of traditional categories through which they monitor these kind of crimes. But you see similar trends in the UK as well. I mean, on the top right, there's the kind of a graph showing the prevent referrals by the type of ideology, and really the category that you see there that's most on the right, the kind of darker line, is a category that's called mixed, unclear, and unstable. So this can be people who believe a mixture of ideological elements. It's a kind of grab bag of different ideologies, people who may be interested in the Nazis, who may be reading Salafi jihadist propaganda, who are maybe quite interested in Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And you really struggle, or certainly the authorities struggle, to put this in one of the existing categories that we're familiar with previously and under which they would have categorized these things previously. And so this is what I think is an increasing hybridization of different extremist communities facilitated by social media. So the first 3 points were mainly, though not exclusively, about the extreme right, as well as this kind of new extremism that's a little bit hard to categorize. But the threat by Islamist extremism, of course, continues. And despite the relative decline of ISIS, certainly in terms of territory, but also to some extent its online presence, there's a continuing kind of culture war being waged by different Salafist and Islamist extremist influences online. And what we've really been observing in our research here is that they're drawing on a very wide and increasing range of formats to give advice on pretty much every aspect of life to their followers. And this includes sermons and speeches, podcasts, kind of citizen journalism, where you can follow different influencers, how they go to protests, how they interview people in the shopping centers. You see a lot of animations that outline historical events from an ideological Islamist perspective, quotes from religious scriptures and kind of narrations built on those, as well as nasheeds, the kind of religious chants. And this really covers a very, very wide range of topics, from the political, the kind of calling for the establishment of a caliphate, calling for attacks on political opponents, denigrating political opponents. But you also see a lot of guidance on seemingly more mundane aspects of life. Am I allowed to do sports? Am I allowed to do this in mixed groups? Can I listen to music? Is it allowed for me to play video games? Is it allowed for me to play video games if there's any kind of fantasy beings being depicted that could be perceived as a form of polytheism from a sort of very strict perspective? And so, as this really are ideologies that seek to influence people in their everyday life and sort of try to give them guidance and a strong moral code in a often chaotic seeming world. Like, I think it's quite crucial to look at the furthest, broader spectrum of content that is being shared by Islamist influencers, and not just on the kind of political side and the kind of pro-violent side. There is, and this is really a fairly new phenomenon over the last few years, but there is a kind of convergence in terms of, there's an aesthetical convergence across a range of very different communities. I think we probably all still remember the rise of the alt-right from sort of 2014, 2015 onwards, and how it became associated not just with the kind of recrudescence of white nationalist ideas, but also with a certain aesthetic, with online subcultures, with memes, with Pepe the Frog, with different kind of jokes, the emphasis on very transgressive humor, attacking political opponents by trolling them. And some of the examples from the extreme right can be seen here on the top. Depictions of extreme right ideology, but using this kind of humorous language, humorous depiction, memes, and this traveled across borders. This wasn't confined to the US. We've at ISD monitored how this spread into Austria, into Germany, into Italy, Sweden. It really was picked up anywhere that there was a kind of active far right that was digitally savvy and was able to draw on some of these things that were being communicated and shared on social media elsewhere. What's very interesting over the past few years is now that we're seeing similar memes and jokes and kind of aesthetics being adopted by people on the Salafi spectrum as well. The kind of memes on the bottom here are all from different Salafi groups, using memes to celebrate the victory of the Taliban last year and the fall of Kabul, communicating certain very regressive gender norms, kind of making references to red pilling, even specifically red pilling, of course, in the alt-right and extreme right context, was kind of the idea that you should have a recognition that really society is structured out around race, and that whites are drawing the kind of short end of the stick in this kind of racial hierarchy. So it was connected to extreme right ideology there, but it's something that's now being adopted by people who mix Salafi and Islamist extremist ideology with the kind of cultural and online reference points of the alt-right. And it's not even confined to Salafism. This isn't like the second movement that's doing this. You find this across a range of authoritarian movements internationally now. You find it amongst Egyptian neo-Nazis, Moroccan monarchists, Hindu nationalists in India, Bolsonaro adherents in Brazil, that there's a kind of adoption of this trolling subcultures, of the humor, of the aesthetics, of the memes, often by young men supportive of these regressive movements. And the last point that I want to point towards is really just based on some observations in terms of how the platform landscape has been shifting over the past few years. I mean, 5-7 years ago, you would have probably still found quite a lot of extremists with very, very large reach on mainstream social media platforms, and most of them. But platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so Instagram have imperfectly, but they've certainly started to do more about the issue around violent extremism, hate speech, and violent conspiracy theories on their platforms, have increasingly used means of deplatforming some of the most notorious and most harmful and potentially danger-posing actors. And this has led to a migration away from the main platforms, where often extremists don't have the same amount of reach, but they nevertheless are able to mobilize, connect with people across borders, and things like that. Now, I think this is interesting to observe, of course, and it's interesting to wonder, like, to what extent are these more ideologically homogenous spaces that may have less reach? To what extent are they radicalizing each other even further? Is this even more dangerous because people feel like they're being cut off from mainstream political discussion and have no means anymore to influence mainstream politics, and are now in their little niche where they're only surrounded by like-minded people? But I think there's something else that we really need to start wondering about in terms of the shifting platform landscape that's used by extremist actors across the ideological spectrum, and that some of these platforms pose different barriers for researching and countering extremist content and behavior. And I think these can really be divided roughly in three boxes, even though you could probably filter them further, which is barriers of fragmentation that with certain platforms, especially the ones that don't have APIs, you're essentially looking for the needle in the haystack. You're looking, you know that there's probably bad content, and it's might even be public, but you just don't know where you're looking for it. And you really don't have a way of kind of trimming the data down to stuff that's more likely to be relevant. You second have ethical problems and at times legal problems. On certain platforms, you need to be there's no way to systematically gather data without breaking the terms of service of certain platforms. So this could put you into contract law issues. There similarly can be issues around privacy, where certain areas of platforms are designated as private, even though it would be quite difficult to justify that, say, communities with 12,000 people in which you can openly find calls for violence could really be counted as private, but they technically might be, and they might be perceived as private. So there's ethical issues with researching some of these spaces. And lastly, there are technological barriers on some of these platforms. On Odyssey, which is partially, though not fully, blockchain-based, but also on platforms like PeerTube, which are very popular now, especially in the German-speaking COVID denier scene, in this among these sort of people who are really, really interested in conspiracy theories about COVID, but now also increasingly about Ukraine and the energy crisis, and these hybrid extremist actors that really have become radicalized over the past years. They're very active on platforms like PeerTube that are essentially decentralized on different servers, and where therefore moderation as well as research is very, very difficult. And so just to sum it up again, these are the 6 kind of claims that I wanted to bring into discussion, and through which I wanted to set the scene for the chat that we're about to have. We're seeing an internationalization of the extreme right, at the same time that formal extremist organizations are becoming less relevant, though not irrelevant. The lines between extremism and adjacent harms are becoming blurred. Islamist extremists continue to operate, drawing on a range of formats online to communicate their message. There's a convergence in the aesthetics of different online subcultures across ideologies, kind of the alt-rightification of different online subcultures. And we're seeing a shifting of the platform landscape that's not only potentially contributing to increased radicalizations of people in these more ideologically homogenous spaces, but that also present barriers to research and also possibly to countering extremist content online. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation over the coming 2 hours.
Thank you so much, Jakob. That's a lot of food for thought, but very nicely packaged. So we could actually remember the main takeaways, as we say. So we already have a question. If platforms used are more peripheral in the sense of more marginal, how are people being lured in?
It's not always easy to say, but I mean, there are actors who specifically link towards more niche platforms. So there might be, sending links on bigger platforms, directing people towards smaller platforms as well. And there can, of course, just be mouth-to-mouth propaganda. I mean, there's certain people might literally be interested in going on Odyssey or so, and then coming across harmful content. But there's quite a lot of interlinking behavior, and we've done some recent work that really, among UK extremists, is not published yet, but I think it's a finding that I can mention already, that among UK extremists, actually more links now go to platforms like DLive, like Odyssey, than go to, say, Facebook or Reddit. So it is part of the picture, certainly, that platforms are being directly linked to. Though Ashton also is raising her hand, and possibly wants to come in right at this very second.
I actually had a question for you, but let me just have a look. What was the question in the chat? If platforms used are more peripheral. Yeah, so certainly from my research, they will advertise their more niche or encrypted platforms in their mainstream platforms. So you see this with ISIS and the far right as well. So if you go onto their Twitter, they'll have a link to their Telegram. So they are very interested in operating in the mainstream because that's the way that they can reach out initially. But it is more about moving to that secretive option, which is obviously more difficult for us to monitor and also infiltrate, particularly if you're talking about platforms like VRChat, DLive, Discord, things like that. But I have a question for Jakob, if that's okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Fascinating stuff. My question is about your overlap between jihadist and far right content. So I've seen a trend basically since the rise of the alt-right, as you were saying, back in 2014, of them plagiarizing, manipulating each other's aesthetics, propaganda, things like that. I'm wondering in terms of what you've seen, if this is a case of them just using what they know works. So, for example, you see that Atomwaffen division will replicate ISIS's training videos. I've seen that you've got male supremacist content in there. Do you think that it's just a case of them just using what works? So they know that the far right was successful with memes, with shit posting. What's your opinion on that stuff, really?
So Fabian was nodding his head, so he may have an even stronger desire than me to come in.
Yeah, I have a big desire because I think this is pretty interesting. I'm also watching that I think all extremists are perfectionating the meme game. Let's say it like this, and I think in the jihadist, I mean, maybe for the discussion afterwards, I think it's really problematic, the cross phenomenon approaches, because I think these are pretty different narratives, and I think this is like a lot of scientists are working on to watch this cross phenomenon approaches. I really don't think this works. I think it's like because ISIS and Al Qaeda and the Taliban, they pulled out a lot of content like Al Qaeda started in the 90s. So there is an online library where youngsters, for instance, can download stuff and cut it together. I think this is like the main thing is how the internet is developing. Like it gets everything gets shorter and not so high quality content. So I think this is the one thing. The other thing is we were like in the project Jamal al-Khatib, we're working like since 2017 in the jihadist scene, and we noticed like beginning in 2018, 2019, that the users that come out of the jihadist scene, that they use like Alman names, but pretty Alman names, like no one has those names right now, like Jakob, I don't know, like Stefan, so this is a form of ironic, I think. So this was the thing I wanted to say. I think like Islamists they use those names as an ironic mention, and they don't copy, they do it like ironic.
I didn't even know that it's such a niche name. I always thought it was reasonably well spread, but no, so I mean, it's worth noting also, of course, that even with the alt-right, I mean, like many of the kind of memes are not sort of inherently created by them, but sort of appropriated by wider internet subcultures or wider internet culture just. And so it's not all that surprising that other movements or people in other contexts would sort of have similar ideas. I do think that obviously the alt-right at a certain point was extremely visible and had a lot of media attention, and including the humor and the transgressive nature. And so So I think it's to some extent complementary. It is a kind of build yourself your own aesthetics approach, as well as something that people may have seen works quite well. I mean, I think you do, of course, look at like what kind of propaganda approaches worked, what kind of tactics worked previously, and people look across ideological borders here. I mean, for strategies as well, of course.